The image of her beautiful body had been offered to her only as a means to awake the far more perilous image of her great soul. The external and, as it were, dramatic conception of the self was the enemy's true aim. He was making her mind a theater in which that phantom self should hold the stage. He had already written the play. This is Pints with Jack, Season 8, Episode 12. Perelandra Chapter 10, Always Very Nearly True. Well, welcome friends to Pints with Jack, your favorite C.S. Lewis podcast run by three Thulkandrians, Matt, David, and Andrew. But today, Matt in absentia. It's very nearly Christmas, and we just couldn't coordinate our schedules, so we'll have to carry on without one of our best.
He thought he was so much better than us in everything.
This season, we're once again following the adventures of Elwyn Ransom, who this time is exploring Perelandra, and today we begin to see a little more clearly the strategy of Weston, or rather, the unmanned force possessing Weston. Hey, David, what's up?
Well, it's been actually a very lovely day. We are recording on a Saturday for a change, and into the evening, which means I have a nice drink up my elbow, ready to go. But I spent most of today outside playing in the snow with Alexander. We made a snowman, although it's a very sort of powdery snow, so it doesn't stick very well. So we sort of piled it up and made a sort of snowman Jabba the Hutt. It's sort of like a big slug. But he enjoyed it, and we did lots of sledding, lots of tobogganing, and
lovely.
Got together with the other brothers-in-law and their kids, and a wild time was had.
A snow dibbock, as it were. Well, it's very, very chilly here in Florida. I actually had to put on a very thin, long sleeve cotton shirt underneath my sweater, and I'm already too warm. So, sorry about that.
Pray for him.
Yes, but I did pick up some firewood at the grocery store, and we have a fire pit that we've never used. So we're gonna pull that out tonight and light it up and enjoy what's chilly for Florida. I'm also preaching in another church tomorrow morning. We're recording this December 21st, the longest night of the year, Over the Rhine says, the shortest day of the year. So I'll be preaching there at St. Thomas Eustace, and then I'm preparing my first Christmas sermon. So I'll be preaching Monday night for Christmas Eve, and then 2 of the 4 services on Christmas Eve before dashing off for Christmas plans.
Wonderful.
Yeah, but it looks like over the holiday, we're going to all go to Tennessee to a cabin, and it looks like I'll get to meet my friends, the Opezies, whose boys I baptized. So we'll do that on my birthday a week from tomorrow, next Sunday. So today
Wonderful.
I am drinking a gift that I got. Did I get this in England? I may have gotten this in England. My friends, the Hornells, have been very generous with me. They gave me my first Macallan 18. They gave me Lagavulin 16, which is a great favorite. So I'm going to pour a dram of that, and I wish I could pour one for all of you.
Well, I've already poured out an Aberfeldy 12. This was a gift from my latest brother-in-law.
Lovely. Is that smoky?
A little.
Okay, good.
There's smoky and smoky. You know. Is it Lagavulin or Lafroig? No, but it is very nice.
I read about some of peat and things like that. The stuff that they burn to get the smoke in. And the older the scotch is, the more the smoke fades. So the subtler it becomes. So we'll see. I still would one of these years love to coordinate a bottle of scotch between all of us. And I still need to send that lovely Australian scotch from Sarah. So I'll send one on to each of you.
In the new year.
In the new year, yes. Are we toasting anyone?
We have nobody in particular to toast, but it's nearly Christmas, so to the Christ child. Cheers.
To the Christ child and his mother. Cheers. Oh, it's still Christmas.
Okay, that's the last time you get to use those.
All right. We'll be past the 12 days of Christmas by the time the next one records.
Possibly. Actually, maybe not. No. You might have one more round of these. Let's move things on with my 100-word summary of Chapter 10. Ransom awakes to hear the Unman telling stories of rebellious women on Earth who saved weak men. it becomes clear that he is having some success at poisoning her mind. When Ransom next wakes, he finds them adorned in robes of feathers and leaves. The lady asks about her beauty, and the unman gives her a small mirror, which terrifies her. The unman tells her she should embrace fear in order to save her race. She eventually throws off her robe, noble and triumphant. Ransom is relieved she has rejected the temptation of vanity, but starts to understand the unman's plan.
Dun, 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 dun. It just gets more and more nefarious, doesn't it?
Yeah. And today the chapter begins at nighttime with Ransom trying to ignore the constant refrain of ransom, ransom, ransom. And actually this morning I was woken with daddy, daddy, daddy. So I can relate to that.
I'm sure you can.
But on the other hand, Ransom is woken up by the sound of the unman speaking to the lady. So, what is he saying to the Green Lady as we begin this chapter?
Well, and I also think it's interesting. I wonder if Jack was not getting much sleep these days, because so much of it begins with sleeping and he's slowly becoming sleep deprived. But when he awakes, he hears the unman telling a series of stories, and he's really uncertain about the connection. But they all seem to deal with women who lived at different periods under quite different circumstances. But then all of these women seem to have suffered a great deal. And they were cast off by society and misunderstood by husbands, and they were very noble and stark and all alone. And I love that line. The stories all ended, in a sense, happily, sometimes with honors and praises to a heroine still living, more often with tardy acknowledgement and unavailing tears after her death. And doesn't that remind you of something?
Mm-hmm. Indeed.
Or while wishing that Psyche would come crawling back to her and apologize, and those fondled wishes that somebody would realize the depth of their mistake and really fulsomely apologize to us. That's probably never going to happen, so perhaps we can let it go. But Ransom's beginning to be suspicious about all these noble pioneers and trying to figure out where he's going with all these stories.
So what is it that the unman's trying to do? I would suggest he's trying to put an image into the lady's head. I'm going to come out and say I think this is the most polyvalent, to use a fancy word, chapter of Perelandra thus far. And we see 3 key books from Lewis in this chapter. We see the Screwtape Letters, because we see how the unman is trying to sway the lady. He's wanting to pollute her imagination. He's wanting just to give her an image that she can just focus her mind around. He's not actually really trying to argue with her. We also see Till We Have Faces, the idea of trying to twist somebody by using their love and encouraging them to use their love incorrectly is throughout the chapter. And the last one, and we get a little vision of this later with Weston himself, we see what evil does in terms of that it turns somebody ghost-like that we've seen in The Great Divorce.
Yeah. There's also that connection to Lewis's unwritten chapter on iconoclasm, where he writes in Joy Davidman's copy of The Great Divorce, which our lovely Steve Beebe owns. It says, there are 3 images I must continually forsake and replace with better ones: my image of God, my image of my neighbor, and my image of myself. And what we see here is Weston really trying to give her a false image of herself and to not see ourselves truly as a great temptation. The other thing that I learned, and I thought it was from Screwtape or personal experience, but it was glad to find an echo of that here in this first paragraph on the first page. If the question aroused by any one story proved at all difficult to answer, the speaker simply dropped that story and instantly began another. And I think that, even in my profession as a priest, I find that my own temptation and the temptations of others, as soon as we recognize, this is Screwtape trying to get us, the enemy very often will stop irritating us, whether or not our irritation at the circumstance goes away. When a method of temptation begins to cease to be effective, the enemy will drop it and come at us sideways. Very often, if an intellectual argument has been kind of winning us over for a while, and then we realize, this is the enemy trying to do it, some physical thing or some emotional thing will come in sideways. And so let's be on guard. It's the holidays and people are tense, and it's the new year and people are tense. Let's be aware that our enemy is always trying to tell us false things, and let's see if we can catch him out.
Here's the image that he's trying to put into the lady's head. What emerged from the stories was rather an image than an idea. The picture of the tall, slender form, unbowed though the world's weight rested upon its shoulders, stepping forth fearless and friendless into the dark, to do for others what those others forbade it to do, yet needed to have it done.
The noble martyr.
Mm-hmm. And there's also subtle undermining of men, because in the earlier part of this book, Ransom was placing his hope in the king, and so did the queen. And the unman, he wants to basically undermine that. So throughout telling all of these stories about these great women, there is this subtle portrait presented of the men who are in their life. The text is this: and all the time, as a sort of background to these goddess shapes, the speaker was building up a picture of the other sex. No word was directly spoken on the subject, because he's subtle, but one felt that there was a huge, dim multitude of creatures, pitifully childish and complacently arrogant, timid, meticulous, unoriginating, sluggish and ox-like, rooted to the earth almost in their indolence, prepared to try nothing, to risk nothing, to make no exertion, and capable of being raised into full life only by the unthanked and rebellious virtue of their females. It was very well done. Ransom, who had little of the pride of sex, found himself, for a few moments, all but believing it.
Yeah.
And that last line there is an echo of something that Lewis wrote in a letter, I think it was to Warney, when he was talking about screw tape, or at least where the idea came from, when he said that he was listening to Hitler. Yes. And he said, just for those few moments, you just started finding yourself nodding along and agreeing before you had to, snap yourself out of the spell that was being cast.
Absolutely. Well, and I was also put in mind of Lewis's second best book, In the Great Divorce, where Mrs. Robert says, "Oh, give Robert to me. I want, I'm useless unless I have someone to do things to." But how she really emasculated him and spilled the tea all over his silly little writing, and drove off all of his friends. And so, yeah, really. Definitely trying to get us to think wrongly about ourselves. I wish this passage were more explored when we talk about questions of Lewis and gender. I think that if you take the opposites of all of these, pitifully childish, complacently arrogant, timid, meticulous, unoriginating, sluggish, I think you could take all of those and then flip them around as you do with screw tape and with Orwell until we have faces, and find a pretty decent image of what Lewis thinks men ought to be.
When I was reading this, I was actually put in mind of the recent spate of girl boss movies that we've had that have just been objectively poor art, but also just incredibly annoying. I'm thinking of things like Captain Marvel, where every single man that's in there is awful, just awful.
Yeah. And very often you get to this. And I think that even our political climate points to the fact that we are still grappling with what it means to be truly masculine or truly feminine. And I understand that there's opinions about a range of the spectrum of gender, and I don't want to get into all of that. But I think some of the appeal in our political choices are appealing to these kind of stereotypes or these overlookings of the masculine. So anyway, I think that Lewis is, seeing 80 years ago what we're still grappling with today. Mm. So then what happens next?
Well, there's thunder, rain, and a flash of lightning. It's beautifully written, but Ransom sees a scene. And in the scene, it's her, the dragons with her, and what's taken over Weston. And it focuses in on the lady's face, because he sees something there that worries him. He takes a little while to realize what it reminds him of, and it's what he describes as the tragedy queen from a play. He says, her expression was one he had not very often met on Earth, except, as he realized with a shock, on the stage. Like a tragedy queen was the disgusting comparison that arose in his mind. So he doesn't even like this comparison, but he says, of course, this was a gross exaggeration. And yet, the tableau revealed by the lightning had photographed itself on his brain. Do what he would, he found it impossible not to think of that new look in her face. He's seen something new happening there. The fatal touch of invited grandeur, of enjoyed pathos. I'd like you to explain that in a moment. The assumption, however slight, of a role seemed a hateful vulgarity. For the first time, he thought "This can't go on," formulated itself in his mind.
Yeah. By the way, a tableau is short for tableau vivant from the French, meaning a living picture. And it's a depiction of a scene usually presented on a stage by silent and motionless costumed participants. And so he's seeing in this flash of lightning, as it were, another sense of this role.
What do you understand by pathos? Because it's quite an important word that appears a few times in this chapter.
Yeah, not just pathos, but enjoyed pathos, right? It's this sense that I have a friend who says, I grew up in a family of ragers, and I am not a rager. I don't get angry, but I'm a finely tuned outrager. And he knows himself well enough to know that when things don't go his way, he feels very slighted, and he feels very noble about his being slighted. And so there's that sense there of this kind of this pathos. Oh, I am so alone and I so enjoy it. We see it, I think, really well portrayed in Orwell's self-pity. I think in some of Pam's self-pity in Great Divorce. I mean, she didn't even intend to have Michael, but she goes on and on as if she is the most wronged person in all the world. And, I think that it's us feeling sorry for ourselves, isn't it? And when I am truly done poorly by, it's very tempting for me to fondle that and to, enjoy how badly I have it and enjoy how noble I am. And then when I deign to forgive them, I'm quite proud of myself and self-congratulatory about how widely I have shown great forgiveness. We're all rather silly, aren't we?
The other character that two characters that spring to mind is from the other Venusian book, The Magician's Nephew. This is Jadis. Yes, this is absolutely. Uncle Andrew. Ours is the high and lowly destiny. They each accumulate and write down all... I'm just seeing Andrew's book.
I got Jadis written on the last page. Yes.
There we go. Both of them have their laundry list of complaints as to how the world has wronged them and how they have done what needed to be done, what only they could do.
Yeah. Well, and I think Shift is like that too, isn't he? He takes on this role and being too high as he ought. And then he also plays with a lightning clap and a thunder to point to how good he is, and to, I think one definition I love of humility is to think of oneself exactly how God thinks of one, right? To acknowledge that I have certain gifts, right? And not to deny them, which is false humility, but also to acknowledge that I have certain weaknesses and not to use them as a flay on my back, but just to acknowledge my strengths and weaknesses and look at myself accurately. And that's part of what Weston's trying to get us to do. And I think that's part of what Lewis is trying to prevent in us, is to see all the ways the enemy on our own world wants us to have a distorted picture of ourselves and an inflated sense of self-worth, which is certainly what's going on here. Fortunately, the lady has better sense than everybody.
At least for a time being.
Yes.
And she goes to shelter from the rain and everyone follows her. And the unman immediately starts to tell a new story. And it was only actually my last reading of this that I heard this and started laughing. There was a queen in our world who ruled over a little land. Andrew, what story was I thinking of?
Who ruled? Or rule? Of course, the story of Orwell didn't come about for many years after this. Nevertheless, this idea of a queen ruling over a little land, I think, probably remained in Lewis's mind.
Mm-hmm. It is funny how far before Till We Have Faces this is, but this is like, was this in his head?
Well, we do know that he was thinking about and trying to write the Cupid and Psyche story as far back as his teens.
Mm-hmm.
And then he tried several forms. But it wasn't until he met a woman who had a really healthy, I think, sense of herself in Joy Davidman that he was able to kind of do it. And so I wonder if this idea just kind of lingered around in his head until he wrote his book 10, 13 years later.
Well, we don't get to hear any more of this story from the unman about this queen who ruled over a little land because the lady interrupts him and bids him to listen to the rain, which is kind of funny. It's, I say, quite a classic gender thing where a guy wants to talk about something specific.
Mm-hmm.
And the lady just wants to enjoy the world that's happening around her. And you see that the unman is kind of blind to this.
Yeah. Well, and she remains in the moment. She remains in what Maladil has sent to her at that moment. And of course, the devil, by his own nature, is filled with what might have been and what should have been and what perhaps could be. Right? And that's screw tape again. We want them thinking about the past or the future, which they can do nothing about. The enemy, God, wants us to be thinking about the present moment or himself. And so here's Orwell listening to the rain. Not Orwell. Tinadrill.
Or Freudian slip right there.
But also, it's when Orwell goes up and it comes down from trying to bury Psyche, that we hear the rain as she's waking up and as she's swooning in her injury and in her illness. And the rain is a quiet witness to God's provision. And it certainly is a demonstration that the gods have accepted the sacrifice of Psyche. And she blows right past the fact that it's raining, and they have been begging for rain for seasons. And so, yes, rain is certainly there. So
now we'll get on to the main meat of the chapter in a moment. But at this point, there is a low growl from some beast that the lady doesn't recognize. The unman says he doesn't know it, but Ransom says he thinks he does. What do you make of that, Andrew?
Well, listeners, David and I had a little conversation about this beforehand, and we're not quite sure. And maybe one of you knows better. When I read that, I thought, oh, there's another detail that Lewis mentioned that I failed to pay attention to, which is usually quite the case. I looked back, and there's only one other mention of the word growl in Paralandra, and that's when he compares the crashing of the waves on the shores of the fixed land to a murmur or a growl. So I'm not sure. It may be the dragon growling. It may be an expression. Well, you had an interesting expression. What did you think about that?
I think it might also be Paralandra itself. We've had the entire planet rejoicing at the lady's victories in the past. Could this be something that's almost the opposite of that? Nature, all creation is groaning, to borrow a phrase from St. Paul, at a perception of what's happening in this little triad.
And later on in the chapter, we know that there's a fair abundance of wildlife around. And sadly, we only know it because the unman is, when he's not trying to tempt the lady, when she sends him away, he's cruelly trying to end any life. And when Ransom prevents Weston from destroying animal life, he begins destroying vegetable life. I mean, just to kill, even to pull up a blade of grass is kind of his default. I think that the picture of the poverty and the stupidity of evil is so well portrayed in this chapter, better than just about anything else I know.
And petty.
Yes, exactly.
Now, the lady tells them to hush as they're arguing about where this growl came from, and that pretty much ends that night's conversation. And then in the book, we've got this long section describing what happens over the coming days and nights. And it's all pretty rough for Ransom because the lady needs less sleep than him, and the unman appears to require no sleep at all. And this meant that whenever Ransom awoke, the unman was usually talking to the Green Lady while he was out of the picture.
And while he was asleep, he was calling out Ransom, and it was a sleepless cruelty going on.
It actually put me in mind of the torture of World War I, where the soldiers were sitting in trenches trying to get rest with a constant barrage and noise, and it just never let up. Even when the lady dismissed them both, because she can do that as a queen, Ransom doesn't get much rest. Why?
Well, as I just mentioned, he's protecting the animals. She needs less sleep than he is, and he's really exhausted. I mean, this is taxing on him. It's physically taxing and mentally taxing and spiritually taxing. He's the only one who is a redeemed sinner. And having to try to keep this world from falling, having to protect this woman is just exhausting. And so between having to protect the whole world, the animal and vegetable world and the queen, he's just wiped out.
And And as in addition to trying to protect the animals, because it even, and I think this is significant for later, because we're told that he would just try and grab at any bird or beast and start to pull out its fur and feathers.
Yeah.
The unman would also just be taunting him and being crude the entire time. The text says, again and again he felt that a suave and subtle Mephistopheles with a red cloak and a rapier and a feather in his cap, or even a somber, tragic Satan out of Paradise Lost, would have been a welcome release from the thing he was actually doomed to watch. It was not like dealing with a wicked politician at all. It was more like being set to guard an imbecile or a monkey or a very nasty child.
Yes. It had a whole repertory of obscenities to perform with its own, or rather with Weston's body, and one can only let one's imagination run wild. But you imagine Lewis being brought up in English boarding schools, probably saw a fair bit of masculine crudity going on, and that's certainly some of what's happening.
And we mentioned before that it's around this time that he's writing preface to Paradise Lost. And
exactly.
in that book, Satan is seen as this tragic figure, and he's often interpreted by many people as a much more interesting, dynamic character, and God and the angels are just kind of a bit boring. And I'm trying to say that again. Mephistopheles, he's a character from Dr. Faustus. He's this demon that offers wishes, and the person he's granting wishes to actually does very little with them. It's all incredibly petty. It's just really just playing little tricks on people.
Yeah.
Ransom was even thinking even that would be better than what I'm actually having to deal with.
Yeah. And what does Billy Joel say? I'd rather laugh with the sinners than cry with the saints. The sinners have much more fun. Certainly not true, and not true certainly once it's at its end. And it becomes, I think that, pleasure, of course, is God's gift. At his right hand are pleasures forevermore. And so pleasure, as Screwtape talks about, is kind of the bait on the hook to get people to do what they should not do. Shakespeare calls it in one of his sonnets, before a joy proposed, behind a dream, right? And so when you actually see, and this is true certainly of our own experience, when I actually give in to whatever sin I have been fondling, it may be pleasurable, like the scripture says, that Moses forsook the pleasures of sin for a season. But at the end, it's empty, and it doesn't have any return on investment, and it leaves me smaller and more, more at odds with myself and the world than if I had resisted it. And that's certainly what's going on here.
And there's this line that it would sit making grimaces at him for hours together, and then for hours more, it would go back to his old repetition of ransom, ransom, ransom. Often its grimaces achieved a horrible resemblance to people whom Ransom had known and loved in our world. And if anyone's seen the movie The Exorcist, there's a similar kind of dynamic there where, while the child is possessed, you start hearing the voices of other people that, in this case, that the priest had known.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's this kind of caricature. It's trying to show false that which is true, and to make false that which is good.
And in particular, one of the people that sort of gets a voice, albeit briefly, is Weston. It seems that for short periods, he regains some control of his body and speaks with his own voice. What did you make of the sorts of things that he says?
My gosh, it's just horrifying. And all of this selfishness. One of the things, they won't let me see my press cuttings. And of course, your press cuttings or your reviews or your, people acknowledging how great you are. What enormous blue bottles, right? There's flies. And of course, Beelzebub is the Lord of the Flies. Terrible things. Oh, and I paid for a first-class ticket, and now I'm crowded out like this. So all of these ways in which he has been shunted aside. He thought he was the great, most noble, most brilliant scientist in the world and the noblest of all men. And now he's getting pushed aside because he has said yes to a powerful and difficult, dangerous force.
And he's re-rehearsing, if that's even a sense, old grievances.
Yes.
If they don't want me in the first 15, they could jolly well do without me. See, so here he's talking about probably being in the first 15 of the rugby team at his school. Okay. It just seems like all of the things in his life, he's just churning. He's just now focused on them and just seething and nursing these grievances seemingly interminably.
Yeah, absolutely. And this kind of self-obsession, it's always poor me. And one can almost pity Weston. He seems to really have been really shunted aside. And then I love this thing. They've taken off my head and put someone else's on me. And so we'll return to that soon, won't we? So.
Yes, in the next book in this series, which will be in 2 seasons' time.
Yeah,
but as you say, this Ransom feels a kind of pity for him, and even prays fervently for his soul.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and so we find more overt references to God and to Ransom's own Christianity here, and that's a real generosity that I think that the Lord wants to encourage in us, even when people are being terrible and influenced by terrible things. It is still our responsibility to pray for them, to show them unconditional love. And one of the things that we'll see at the very end of Weston's earthly or Venusian life is one last chance always offered. And that was something that struck me in the science fiction books, I think, first of all. If one last chance will get you there, God will certainly offer that. And that's true of God's mercy for sure.
And this passage really is the great divorce passage in this book. Up till that moment, whenever he had thought of hell, he had pictured the lost souls as being still human. Now, as the frightful abyss which parts ghosthood from manhood yawned before him, pity was almost swallowed up in horror, in the unconquerable revulsion of the life within him from positive and self-consuming death. If the remains of Weston were, at such moments, speaking through the lips of the unman, then Weston was not now a man at all. The forces which had begun, perhaps years ago, to eat away his humanity had now completed their work. The intoxicated will, which had been slowly poisoning the intelligence and the affections, echoes of Screwtape, had now at last poisoned itself, and the whole psychic organism had fallen to pieces. Only a ghost was left, an everlasting unrest, a crumbling, a ruin, an odor of decay. So this is the result of hellish creatures. We talk about heavenly and hellish creatures and those small decisions compounding over time. Here we see in Weston the final result of those hellish choices that he's made throughout his life.
Well, and here what we see too is the dwarf and the tragedian, right? Where the dwarf finally crawls up the leash and disappears, and we have kind of this dwarf and the tragedian. There's an echo because the noble lady Sarah Smith, and so I think, and it's right around the same time. I mean, he writes Great Divorce. He publishes it in 46. It was scheduled in late 45, but it's right around the same time. So I wouldn't be surprised if some of this is kicking around. And one has to think that this was read to the Inklings, right?
Yeah. Yes, quite likely. And what the unman is trying to do here is trying to turn the Green Lady from Sarah Smith into the tragedian. It's literally those two things, the goodness of Sarah Smith and the high and noble destiny, the tragedy of the tragedian.
Yeah, but also the coquette, right? The woman who doesn't even have a body yet she's trying to flirt, with everybody and be attracted and attract people. She's mindful of her own attractiveness and beauty.
Well, we're going to get onto that bit, so let's do that now. We're told about the conversations between Ransom, the Tempter, with a capital T, I might add.
Yep.
And the Green Lady. Although sometimes successful, Ransom realizes that the unman is incrementally gaining ground.
Yes.
And when he bids the lady to send them both away, she rebukes him. And this is how he knows that he's in trouble, because she says, "Shall I go and rest and play while all this lies on our hands? Not till I am certain that there is no great deed to be done by me for the king and for the children of our children."
It's a good thing to love one's spouse and to love one's progeny. But we also hear this kind of echo of the mother who's living her life for everybody else. And she is teetering perilously close. Yeah.
We're told that the unman, he keeps presenting her with ideas of the great deed, of the great risk, of a kind of martyrdom. And he's presenting them to her every day, varied in 1,000 forms. He's just trying to flood her mind with an image more than anything else, hoping that image will reside from her imagination into her thought and then ultimately into her will.
Yeah. I have some friends who have a large and loving family, but they have had their share of difficulties, and occasionally they participate in what they call the Martyr Olympics. And so somebody says, oh my gosh, I've had to work 80 hours this week. Oh yeah, well, I had to work 85 hours and my feet were killing me. Oh, you think your feet are killing you, And so this kind of outdoing oneself in being, being poorly treated. And that's where she's teetering towards.
And we said a little earlier as to how the unman is trying to sideline the idea of the king.
Yeah.
And he keeps leaning on this, and any reference to the king is treated as cowardice.
Sure. He says the whole point of her action, the whole grandeur, would lie in taking it without the king's knowledge, in leaving him utterly free to repudiate it, so that all the benefits should be his and all the risks hers. And with the risk, of course, all the magnanimity, the pathos, the tragedy, and the originality. Oh, I did all of this for you, the martyr salute, with the back of your hand against your forehead. And you don't even appreciate all that I've done for you. Yeah, she's really setting herself up. And it's kind of meant to make her do things without the king when she's designed to do things with him, isn't she?
Yeah, exactly. And the tempter says the opposite. He hints that there'll be no use in asking the king what he thinks, because he would certainly not approve of the action, because men are like that.
Yeah.
The king must be forced to be free.
Yeah.
This is echoes of the great of the four loves all over the place.
Sure.
The coercion of love for the supposed good of the other.
Yeah.
Now, while she was on her own, now or never, the noble thing must be achieved. And this idea of now is the moment and you're going to lose it is. He even notes that this is a very common fear here on earth, and this is what the unman leans into.
It also reminds me of some of the arguments for Judas and what Judas did. And, Jesus wasn't going to sacrifice himself until Judas forced his hand. And so maybe Judas was actually doing the right thing by betraying Christ. And this is exactly that an exposing of that falsehood, here again.
And what's the opposite of that is at the other end of Jesus' ministry when his mother says they have no wine. And so she goes to Jesus and she speaks to the king and then leaves it in his hands.
Yes. Do as he says, right?
Mm-hmm. Do whatever he tells you.
Do whatever he tells you to do, which is one of the greatest things that anyone has said on this earth.
It's good advice.
Yeah. Yes.
But the unman, you named this episode, and I think it's a really good one because much of what the unman says is true. Or almost always nearly true. It's very often a caricature for his point, but he then argues about men on Earth, on Thulcandra, subjugating women, and he basically warns the lady, don't let that happen here. Mm-hmm. And the way that she can stop that happening is if she takes the initiative. If she goes ahead and she is this great martyr, if she is the rebel to go and do the thing that Maleldil secretly wants her to do, even though he says not to, and even though the king wouldn't like it.
Yeah. Well, and I took the phrase from this passage. What the unman said was always very nearly true. And that's the truth of the voice of temptation, of the voice of the enemy. It wouldn't, the closer we get to God, the more obvious his lies become. And so the more he fills them with truth. And 95% of what he says is true, but with a little hook, a little caveat that will always turn us away from his will and always turn us towards our own and our own selfishness. And that's the subtlety of Screwtape. And that's part of, I think, why Lewis writes this book, is so that we could hold up this book as a mirror to ourselves and say, how often are we willing to kind of accept not the half-truth, But the 95% truth, the 98% truth, the 99% truth, and then just turn a blind eye to the little lie that we are swallowing and feel noble as we do it. And that's certainly what the unman's trying to accomplish here.
But it all seems to fall apart when she starts to grapple with some new words that he's teaching her.
Mm-hmm.
It says he taught her words like creative and intuition and spiritual. But that this was one of his full steps, or its full steps, sorry.
Yes.
When she had at last been made to understand what creative meant, she forgot all about the great risk and the tragic loneliness and laughed for a whole minute on end. Finally, she told the unman that it was younger than the piebald and sent them both away.
Yeah.
And I would suggest that he's got MacDonald at the back of his mind with regards to this passage. There's an entry in the anthology, and it comes from Unspoken Sermons, where MacDonald talks about when creation is applied to the greatest human genius, it's actually a mockery of humanity, because what is humanity but itself a creation?
Right.
What we are doing, according to Tolkien, will be sub-creation.
Yes, sub-creation.
We understand where we are in the great order of being. We are not doing the creating. We are taking what God has given us and shaping it.
Yeah, we are combining things that have already been made, but in doing so, we're imitating the creator. But we acknowledge that that's what we're doing, and that's part of where Tolkien's work, and especially his poem Mythopoeia, is so brilliant. So, and then Ransom loses his temper. Right? Why does that happen?
Well, I think it's just he sees this twisted notion of sacrifice that the unman is trying to push forward, and he just loses it. The text says he tried to tell her that he had seen this kind of unselfishness in action, to tell her of women making themselves sick with hunger rather than begin the meal before the man of the house returned, though they knew perfectly well that there was nothing he disliked more. Of mothers wearing themselves to a ravelling to marry some daughter to a man whom she detested. Of Agrippina and of Lady Macbeth. Can you not see, he shouted, that he is making you say words that mean nothing? What is the good of saying you would do this for the king's sake, when you know it is what the king would most hate? Are you Maleldil that you should determine what is good for the king? And I think those literary references there are kind of interesting. Can you tell us a little bit about Agrippina and Lady Macbeth?
You know, Lady Macbeth, of course, really kind of pushed her husband on. She's in some ways the tragic queen that we see, and really pushed her husband to do things that were unspeakable, to commit murder and to be horrible for the sake of their own ambition. And she's doing it all for him. So, and we find in Agrippina, the wife of Claudius, also pushing her husband to do unspeakable things, and kind of it's a bit of a Bonnie and Clyde thing, and Weston is trying to, make her be this kind of tragic figure and an independent figure. She should be one with the king, and he's trying to make her different. And we'll see this difference come at the end of the chapter with the mirror. He's trying to take her out of herself, to look at herself wrongly, or to look at herself when she should be looking at someone else. And the subtlety of what would the king want you to do? Any good counselor or recovery specialist would upbraid her for her codependency. And she knows clearly what she's supposed to do. She's supposed to seek the king and listen to Maleldil. But in his pattern of repetition, Weston is filling her with these doubts. And I mean, it's masterful because she hasn't sinned. She's unfallen. And for him to worm her way, and every time I read this chapter, I think, oh, maybe the temptation in the garden was not a matter of a moment's work, but a matter of a month's work, right? Maybe the enemy was always sidling up to her when she was alone. And maybe by the time she gets to the point that she takes from the tree, she's already been subjected to this. And then what you see too is, ironically, this picture of the ineffective male at her side. Because when she took and eat, the Bible says, Genesis says, she gave to her husband who was with her, which means that he was there and witnessing all of that, and he did not stop it. We hear again and again in this chapter, this cannot go on. And that sense that it has to stop is building and building, and we'll see where that goes next in the next chapter or two.
And all of this is so powerful because there is a good deal of truth to what the unman is saying. He's saying that Maleldil wants you to grow, to become more yourself. And that's true, but not like this.
Yes.
Lewis has this line, but for that very reason, the fatal step, which once taken, was thrust her down into the terrible slavery of appetite and hate and economics and government, which our race knows so well, could be made to sound so like the true one.
Mm-hmm.
But if her will was uncorrupted, half her imagination was already filled with bright poisonous with bright poisonous shapes. And this is the second time he thinks to himself, this can't go on.
This can't go on. Yes, it was cruelly complicated and always very nearly true. Yeah, very subtle.
And then one night, Ransom falls asleep and awakes to find himself alone, and he hunts for them, and then he eventually finds them. And they have dressed themselves up in feathers and leaves.
Yeah. There's this, of course, echo of what happens in Adam and Eve, right? So when God comes to find Adam and Eve after they have fallen and their eyes have been opened, they have covered themselves with leaves, with fig leaves. And then God covers them with the skins of animals. And so there is in our world blood sacrifice to cover over the results of sin. And we see that right there in our first mother and father. What you see here is this really, really malevolent, cruel, vicious parody of that, because while the leaves had come from the trees, Ransom knows where the feathers came from. And
the lady says, he found them. I was like, okay, yes. Keep telling yourself that.
Right. But also feathers fall. And I'm like, crap, of course. Yes, feathers fall. Maybe he found fallen feathers. No. He's been up all night, torturing and plucking off the wings of the feathers of birds. And so, again, very always nearly true. And so he's clothing her in a thing of great beauty, terrestrially speaking, that comes at an enormous blood cost. So.
And she asks Ransom, why did you never tell me about this? Trees have leaves, beasts have fur. Why didn't you tell me that men and women in your world also hang beautiful things about them?
Yes.
And he says, well, it's much colder there. She says, yes, but this guy here, he says that even in places where it's warm, they do it. And Ransom asks, well, why did he tell you that they do it? And she said, to look beautiful. And this is a classic Lewis pivot. It's not really what you're expecting. Thank heaven, thought Ransom. He is only teaching her vanity, for he had feared something worse. Yet, could it be possible in the long run to wear clothes without letting modesty, and through modesty, lasciviousness?
And then she interrupts him. Do you not think that we are more beautiful? And he lies to her. No. And then correcting himself, I don't know, which is maybe less of a lie. And finds it not easy to reply. He says, the text says, the unman, now that Weston's prosaic shirts and shorts were concealed, looked a more exotic and therefore a more imaginatively, less squalidly hideous figure. As for the lady, that she looked in some ways way worse was not doubtful, yet there was a plainness in nudity, as we speak of plain bread, a sort of richness, a flamboyance, a concession, as it were, to lower conceptions of the beautiful, had come with the purple robe. And so she looks like somebody that he could conceivably love, and this was intolerable. The ghastly inappropriateness of the idea had, all in one moment, stolen something from the colors of the landscape and the scent of the flowers. And so he dresses her up for the sake not only of vanity, but to kind of create again this false image. And then for the first time, it's almost as if he feels like he could be attracted to her because she's dressed up like an earthly woman. And so Weston's just pulling out all the stops, isn't he?
And the lady says that everyone should wish to be as beautiful as they can be, even though they can't see themselves. And it's then that the unman introduces what's probably a shaving mirror. And she responds with fear.
Yes.
She says, my face out there looking at me. Am I growing old or is it something else? I feel my heart is beating too hard. I am not warm. What is it? She glanced from one of them to the other. The mysteries had all vanished from her face. It was as easy to read as that of a man in a shelter when a bomb is coming.
Yes. My heart is beating too hard. I am not warm, right? She has this feeling. And so now we understand that even in an unfallen world, to an unfallen person, fear can happen. And he's getting dangerously close to pushing her over the edge. And here we have, of course, a mirror, which is huge in Lewis. Certainly till we have faces, but we also have the mirror.
The Voyage of the Dawn Treader.
Yep, that Eustace looks into. And we have kind of the false mirror that Lucy looks into when she's reading the book. And so an invitation to see oneself as one wants to be instead of as one ought. And even this mirror, which could be so good, turns itself, of course, into a Narcissan tool. And of course, the symbol for a woman, like the astrological symbol for Venus is a circle on a cross, but that picture is a hand mirror. Right? That symbol is a hand mirror, and Venus's symbol is that of somebody so obsessed with her own beauty that she'll do almost anything for it. That's how the whole Trojan War started with Paris's apple, didn't it?
Yeah. And the unman wants her to effectively lean into it, embrace the fear, and even then save the king from the fear. He's coming back to this idea of like, you need to be great. You need to be this great sacrifice on behalf of others, whether they want it or not. And there's this wonderful exchange where the lady asks, is it good? Ransom says no. And then the unman says, how can you find out without trying? And then Ransom responds with a question, which we should always think of when we're about to commit something that is a little dubious. If you try it and it is not good, how do you know whether you'll be able to stop doing it?
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And it puts to lie the kind of old expression, oh, well, you can't know good until you've known bad. Well, that's not true, right? Eat a strawberry ice cream cone and then eat, a cow pie and see if the strawberry ice cream cone tastes any better. No, the cow pie just tastes worse, right? It's not true that good things get better by comparison. That's not how things work. So,
And the lady then sees herself in the clothes and she chooses to discard them. And the unman tries to convince her to keep them. And when she's confused by this, he then leans into the idea that, oh, I had forgotten that you would not live on the fixed land, nor build a house, nor in any way become mistress of your own days. Which is very nasty. And he appeals to her vanity, saying, oh, I could give this to you. It would be the Queen's mirror. Nobody else could get this apart from you. It's a gift out of deep heaven. And we mentioned about what God and Satan want in terms of where they want our focus to be. And with Satan, it's always in the past, it's always in the future, not actually receiving what God gives us now. Because the unman says there can be no gifts, no keeping, no foresight, while you live as you do from day to day like the beasts.
Right. The lust, the flesh, the eyes, and the pride of life. She saw that it was good for eating. She looked and she saw that it was good for eating and for making one wise. It's that same thing. And I hadn't thought about this until you started talking. So bully for you. It's a possession. And to possess something means to have it. And to have something means to have it where somebody else doesn't have it, right? And so and he's wanting her to possess even herself. And Christ comes to give it all away, right? That's what Christmas is all about. It's about giving away, not about what do I have for myself. But that's one of the great temptations, isn't it always? Oh, what do I want for me? We're in front of Christmas and it's always, and even worse for me is my birthday. I expect every light to go green on my birthday and I expect every parking space to open up. And, I go through all of the little discounts and deals that you get on your birthday where you get a free sub at, Firehouse and Grand Slam at Denny's and a mini buntlet cake from Nothing Bunt Cakes. And I feel like the whole world should go my way. And my birthday is a very dangerous spiritual time for me because I spend most of the year trying to put myself second and deny myself and take up my cross and follow him. And this idea of self-possession, especially appealing to all of the, different free desserts and discounts that I could get on my birthday, is very, very dangerous. And that's where she's teetering closely towards, because Weston knows his work, doesn't he? So what does he awaken her as he's doing this?
Well, I mean, I'm just going to read the final paragraph because it sums up everything that's been working thus far. And I think things become a little clearer.
Mm-hmm.
So while the young man's been saying all of this, the lady did not appear to be listening to him. She stood like one almost dazed with the richness of a daydream. She did not look in the least like a woman who is thinking about a new dress. So it hasn't been about the clothes per se. It hasn't been about the mirror per se. The expression of her face was noble. It was a great deal too noble.
Yes.
Greatness, tragedy, high sentiment. These were obviously what occupied her thoughts.
And this reminds us of Jadis in The Magician's Nephew, and how they go from being kind, the kings of Charn, go from kings and queens, go from being kind to being incredibly more cruel. And her haughtiness, I mean, there's this, it was a great deal too noble is exactly the picture of her that I always get in my head. And there's a great illustration of that. Carry on. Yeah, sorry.
Ransom perceived that the affair of the robes and the mirror had been only superficially concerned with what is commonly called female vanity. The image of her beautiful body had been offered to her only as a means to awake a far more perilous image of her great soul. The external and, as it were, dramatic conception of the self was the enemy's true aim. This is the best bit. He was making her mind a theater in which that phantom self should hold the stage, should be the protagonist. He had already written the play.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it's almost a reversal of Plato's allegory of the cave too, And so, yeah, he's really to be a role, to step outside of one, and of course, the Greek word for actor is hypocrite. Right, and so that's what he's tempting her towards. Oh, now I got the shivers. So, my heart's beating fast, and I'm feeling cold all over. I do not like it either. Well, we have missed Matt, and so our final toast to Matt.
Cheers.
And blessings to you, Matt, and Mary Margaret on this Christmas season. And I hear the call for final drinks. We'll eschew the jingle bells in exchange for a healthy little chime. So our deepest thanks for our intern, Julia, for our sound engineers, Taylor and Sarah. We also want to thank our Patreon supporters as always, particularly our top tier supporters, Jody, Robert, Mark, Matt's wife, Mary Margaret, Rowdy and Angela, David and Peter. A cheers to James and Kate and John, to Sarah and Rebecca, to Meg and Brian, to Joanna. Cheers to Kelly and Stephen and Gary. Cheers to Paul, Kay, Becca and Shane. Cheers to Thomas and Amanda, to Joel, Erica, Matt and James, to Bud 1, to Bud 2, to Edgar, Aldo, Kevin and Mark. And at the end of the year, at the end of our recording, cheers also, and our thanks to you for listening.
Actually, Taylor sent me a message saying that Sarah was going to be taking over the editing for the next couple of episodes because he was going on a cruise with his wife. And so I told him that I would be letting all of our listeners know that he's gone off to be a pirate. And if you know Taylor, you would know that he would be a great pirate.
He would be a magnificent pirate.
And so with that, please join us next time
when we'll continue going farther up and farther in.
Cheers.
Cheers. And now I'm going to get some rum. Yo ho ho.